Welcome to Mentoring Moments. Mentoring Moments is a sub-series of the eCommerce Edge podcast. It is composed of clips taken from Jason's one-to-one and group mentorship sessions. Everybody, and welcome to another episode of the eCommerce Edge podcast. We're looking forward to having this conversation with our incredible next guest today, Mr. Abe Orgel. And he is the CEO of Simple Forwarding. Welcome to the podcast, Abe.
Hi, Jason. Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure to have you along with me for the ride today. And certainly we'll get into, there's a lot to cover off today. Obviously, the quote unquote Liberation Day is happening in America. You're based in New York as a freight forwarder, and there's massive disruption happening to global logistics right now, global trade. Everything seems to be reorganized. Trump has announced massive tariffs that have gone into effect from today, ranging anywhere from a minimum of 10% on every country in the world, all the way up to about 45%, I think it is in China now. So there's some massive disruption happening around the world from a trade and logistics and global supply chain perspective. But before we get into that, why don't you tell me how you even got to be in this space in the first place? At least as far as I can tell, you've always worked in supply chain all the way back from 2020 when you started up your franchise in Express. But why don't you tell us how you came to be, like what interested you about global supply chain and logistics?
Okay, sure. So actually, it's by coincidence. It wasn't intentional. I started helping a small company that we did some manufacturing and they struggled. So they took me on to help them. I started as a partner. I did it for 5 months, but obviously the biggest obstacle you have when you're dealing with supply chain is delay. And one of our productions were really late. So I started asking around for faster transit time options, right? So I came across a company that does a lot of air freight. And that company was Simple Forwarding. So I wasn't the founder of Simple Forwarding, full disclaimer. Met with the owner. It was a very small company. And he just started out a couple months earlier and really hit her off. I wasn't planning on staying with that small company because things didn't work out and there wasn't any potential. So I was looking for my next sales career. I always liked sales. So we got together. I really liked him, really liked me. So we said, you know what? It's a match. We started doing sales for Simple Forwarding. So as I started doing sales, I started developing more relationships with vendors as well. And so I started growing the business to a level where I was more of a partner and less of a sales rep. So it was 2 partners and they gave me a 3rd partnership. But after a while, they had other businesses. So we decided we're going to part ways. I bought them out and now I'm 100% owner of Simple Forwarding. So yeah, I never thought that I'll be involved in supply chain. I never even grew up anything close to supply chain other than the port in Elizabeth. That was pretty close to where I grew up. But other than that's how I landed. And they say for foreigners, for outsiders, they don't know what it is. But once you get hooked to it, you can't leave.
It's interesting because I've often been a fan of saying and describing e-commerce and digital transactions as really logistics with a pretty face, logistics with a customer-friendly face. And so nothing happens in this world, whether it be B2B, B2C, D2C, there's really nothing that happens in this world without effective, efficient, easy to access, easy to use supply chains globally. Now, now I happen to know what a freight forwarder is because when I had my own e-commerce pure play many years ago, based in New Zealand, we worked with a freight forwarding company that basically managed all of our logistics for us. They did freight broking, they would arrange FOB freight carriage, they would organize pickup and delivery, they would transship items under bond through specific countries. They would basically manage everything to do with our supply chain, with our international suppliers. Basically, we would just give them the information and they would manage everything from there. We didn't really have to think about the benefit, I suppose, that we experienced by having a freight forwarding partner is that we didn't have to think about organizing carriers and pickup times and delivery dates. And all we did is we just gave them the information. Hey, we need to get this product from this location and basically from this address to this address. Can you help us do that? And they would go away and would do that. They would organize all the carriage. They would add a small margin for themselves on top, and then they would send us an invoice every month. So that's the experience I have had. And many of the, I guess, the brands, the businesses that are listening to this podcast, they may never have dealt with a freight forwarder before. They may have never dealt with a customs broker before. They may have never dealt, maybe the closest they've gotten to supply chain is dealing with the 3PL on the outbound side, but they've never necessarily had to deal with complex international freight flows, because if they're dealing with their suppliers on a basis where the supplier deals with all the freight on their behalf, and then they basically just add it to the pro forma invoice, maybe on a pro rata basis, an LTL basis, whatever it is, then they may never have had to think about this. But if you have had to manage your own freight internationally, then you probably will have heard of a freight forwarder, what they do. So first of all, why don't you tell me, and for the benefit of my audience, in the simplest terms possible, what is a freight forwarding service in the first place?
So actually, I think you've coined it perfectly well when you said it's your partner, it's your logistical partner. But use even a simpler version of it is we facilitate the transportation of freight. Okay. And with freight forwarding, we usually focus on international. So we're going to facilitate overseas, deep sea freight transportation, airline by air freight. But it evolves into a full-fledged, almost 3PL, because it involves different carriers, different modes of transportation. And yes, we do customs as well, and the final mile trucking as well. So when people ask if I do trucking, I'll say, yes, I do, but it comes along with doing the freight. But yeah, that's pretty much what freight forwarding does. I hope that was simple enough, or...
Yeah, no, I think that this is just a really important concept for my listeners to understand. If you are working with multiple international suppliers of your goods, whether it be finished goods manufacturers, contract manufacturers, whether you're bringing in components and doing an element of local assembly, it doesn't really matter what kind of business you are in. If you need to be doing international freight and carriage to get those goods from wherever they're coming from, and you need to get them to a place inside your home country for then further distribution, whether it be shipping back out again internationally and cross-border on a individual sale basis, or shipping domestically, and that would usually, a freight forwarder in my experience would typically have the inbound freight that's international be forwarded to your local 3PL provider or 4PL provider. That's the typical arrangement that I've seen and I've experienced. Or if you own and run and manage your own warehouse, as I did when I had my own e-commerce pure play business, the freight forwarder would make the destination for the freight our warehouse, our owned warehouse. We would then devan it. We would then put it away into the pallet racking and put it away and make it available for pick, pack, dispatch. We would put it into our inventory management system and we would be off to the races. The 3PL partner, if you don't do that yourself and you don't have an owned warehouse, you'll typically work with a 3PL or a 4PL provider, and they will devan the goods. They will enter it into their warehouse management system, update the inventory feed back to your ERP or whatever it is that then flows into your commerce systems, your point of sale systems, etc. So that's the typical, I guess, design pattern that I've experienced. And is that typically what you see as well? Let's say you are a partner with a pure play online retailer, right? And they're sourcing goods from all over the world. And they don't want to have to become an international shipping expert. They don't want to have to find the cheapest, most efficient, fastest way to get things to you. Or, for example, during COVID, what we saw is that freight forwarders just got slammed with work because it was like, okay, our normal supply chains have broken down. We run maybe a just-in-time model, meaning we forecast how much we think we're going to sell next month. We get it on the water to where it arrives just before, or in theory, just before we're due to run out of stock. So we try to do some element of demand planning, supply chain management, etc. But when a shock happens to the system, like COVID or like this massive tariff change, what I see happening is sometimes we would reach out to a freight forwarder such as yourself, our partner, and we would say, I don't really care how you get it to me. If you get it to me by camel, if you get it to me by air, if you get it to me by sea, carrier pigeon, I don't really care. but I need these goods now because every day that goes by that I don't have these goods is a lost sales opportunity. And if one of my competitors can get the goods sooner than me, then that's potentially a permanent lost opportunity. So it feels like freight forwarders play such a mission critical role in the supply chain, meaning that they have all of the connections, they have all of the software, they have the API connections, they have the connections with local customs departments, they know the regulatory environment, they understand when things have to be quarantined and fumigated and all the different rules and regulations of getting goods from one country to another country efficiently and, I guess, in compliance with local requirements so that everything is done legally. That is my understanding.
Yeah. Wow. So you've said, I think, every aspect of what a freight forwarder does. Not every freight forwarder is going to go the full extent of it, but I think you started with the first comment that said you don't want to have to educate yourself on anything international trade and compliance if you are doing e-commerce. You want to focus on design, product development, PPC maybe,
branding,
marketing. Yeah. You're going to have to take a bachelor's and a master's in international trade if you only decide to sell like teddy bears and maskets. It's not your alley. It's not your sweet spot. So that's what we do. And I think that the question is also has evolved because since COVID, freight forwarding, like you said, played mission critical. Although prior to COVID, I would say it was also mission critical, just that people did not realize what a bad supply chain looks like. So they needed an awakening call to realize that a freight forwarder is not just, I call it a necessary evil.
Yeah.
It's something that you want to rely on. And one statement that I'll tell my customers all the time is, yes, I'm an integrated logistics partner, but I want you to know that when you're pursuing opportunities or a lag that up, you want to know that you can count on me to help you. And one very common question, people would call me and say, I have an opportunity in Canada. We're US based, right? New York, but we operate in the US. I have an opportunity in Canada. I don't know if I should pursue it. And I'm like, we do Canada all the time. So those kind of questions, like you have a pending sale or you want to expand into different marketplaces and you're just too afraid to do it. And I'm like, setting up shop in Canada is easier than you think. So I think this is also, me personally, is part of my job, is to help you pursue opportunities that you would otherwise think it's impossible, if that makes sense.
Totally. And also, I think a good freight forwarder will be able to help you identify where and when it's worthwhile to set up, say, a nexus of operations or a business entity or a subsidiary, because you may benefit from some of the local tax benefits, some of the local tariff benefits, et cetera, if you've got actually a business entity in that region or in that country. So I think a freight forwarder almost has to be, there's elements of being an accountant, almost elements of being a lawyer. There's elements of being a logistics specialist. There's so much more. They're an essential business partner. I think they are as essential, especially if you are doing international trade. Now, if you're pure domestic, probably not. But if you are doing any form of international trade, I think having a good customs and freight broker, freight forwarder in your corner is just as mission critical to your business, or at least it should be, as having an amazing accountant, an amazing lawyer, an amazing marketer. Like, I just think that these are absolutely fundamental capabilities that you must have in your business if you want to be able to do things in a way that is sustainable financially for your business, commercially for your business, but also making sure that you are able to get the goods into your customers' hands when the market opportunity arises. And also making sure that the contribution margin makes sense, because obviously international logistics is very expensive. And so there's oftentimes a compromise that has to be made, right? There's a compromise that has to be made between, okay, sea freight is a fraction of air freight. It also has a time factor associated with it, anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks, depending on where the goods are coming from, if they're coming to America, for example. Or when I was living down in New Zealand, It could be 16 weeks on the sea. Air freight might be 2 to 3 days, but it might be orders of magnitude. It might be 10 to 20x the cost. But if you're selling fashion goods that are light and volumetrically small, maybe it doesn't matter as much. But if you're selling, I do work almost exclusively now in the B2B world, so manufacturers and distributors selling to businesses. And if you're working in an industrial machinery manufacturing business, and you are having industrial machinery lathes and things like that manufactured, for example, in China, and they now need to make their way to the United States, you're never going to ship those by air because there are thousands and thousands of pounds of freight per item and volumetrically absolutely massive. So this is also an area where freight forward, in my mind, helps you make these strategic decisions and the compromises between speed and cost of freight. They're your essential partner to help figure out what works. And this may not work universally across all categories that you sell. Some items you may bring in via air freight because it makes sense commercially to do. And some items you might bring in via sea freight because it makes more sense to do it that way. So I don't think you can have a blanket policy for how you manage your freight. And that's where a freight forwarder starts to come in and give you options.
Yeah, I love that you touched on that topic because with e-commerce, I think it's really relevant. I'll give you one example, but maybe I'll have more examples that pop in my mind. So I had a conversation with a dropshipping company. So what they primarily do is they dropship from China directly to the consumer, which is quite common, especially with the e-commerce boom, with the DDP type of shipping and all that. What they were doing is dropshipping obviously doesn't take 2 days. Whether they sold, I don't remember if they sold on Shopify or Amazon, but in any event, you have to say what your shipping policy is. And I was trying to crunch the numbers with that brand, and we talked about shipping cost direct to consumer comes out to be such and such per unit, and the profit margins and all that. And then I asked, why don't you ship bulk and you deliver from within the US? And he says, A, because I don't want to have a warehouse, and B, because I don't have that many sales to justify cash flow investment. And the money, my business model, I still make profit. And if I have to take out the money, keep it in a warehouse, pay for storage fees, and then the shipping domestically, I'm not sure if it's going to justify. So I said, what percentage, let's just take an example. How many orders do you have a day or a week? Okay, let's just for argument's sake, it was 100 orders a week. I said, you do understand that the 100 people that are buying from you would quadruple if you had a 2-day shipping promise, a 3-day shipping promise. And he says, I can hear that. I said, why don't we do an experiment? Why don't we do one product that you're shipping a very small quantity, but not direct to consumer? You're keeping it in your basement, right? And let's say it's 100 units, but that product, you're going to change the shipping policy to say prime speed. Okay, it's fulfill prime if you're selling on Amazon, or just 2 to 3 days. And then don't look at hitting goal, just look at trends. Look at the uptick.
The conversion trend, basically.
Yes, exactly. And if you could see an indicator, because all you need is an indicator to show that your obstacle that kept you in the small 100 orders a week and whatever, maybe you'll have one answer that answers both questions. You're going to start fulfilling from the US, and you'll have more sales, less total cost, landed cost, and then you can grow and you can scale. Because one of the biggest concerns that they had was they were utilizing the de minimis less than $800. And so they said, I don't see how I could justify shipping larger quantities and pay the duties. And that's where I started crunching the numbers, showing them. And it's not that this method works for everyone. On the other hand, there will be brands that, yes, they should do direct to consumer, or everyone has different models and whatnot. But with e-commerce, I think it's all the more relevant to look at every structure. Direct to consumer has multiple structures. You could do it from China. You could do it from Canada, from Mexico. You could do it from within the US, but it can be FBM, self-fulfilled prime. It could be slower transit, especially people are trying to tighten the belt a little bit. Maybe you want to offer cheaper product and say it's going to take 7 to 10 days. You have some e-commerce solutions like DHL e-commerce, right? So with the current climate, I think it's really important to look at multiple structures and evaluate every couple of months, reevaluate to see what works and what can be improved.
Yes. Now, I totally agree. And one of the things that is starting to impact, is going to impact absolutely everyone, if it hasn't already, as they work through existing stock and inventory. Now that these new tariffs, it's a kind of a minimum 10% tariff on all international goods. And there's been up until now, there's been some weird and wonderful gymnastics that have been done in international logistics, routing through countries like Mexico that had favorable trade policies with America. Until now, country of origin started to get real murky. Okay, where was these goods made? Okay, cool. If they were imported by a company in Mexico and then they were on-sold to a company in America, where was the country of origin? Was it China, if it was shipped from China to this company in Mexico, and then they were on-sold from the Mexican company into America? Was this a Mexican good or was this a Chinese good? So it's a real challenge. I think it sounds easy to implement these international tariffs. And one of the reasons why I think Trump has gone down this path is because it's easier to have blanket rules than it is to try to do it country by country and have these unique exclusions or these category exclusions. I have seen customs books, the customs code books, and they are like a phone book with what tariffs, what levies, what additional taxes, what additional compliance costs come along with goods, and those change monthly, if not quarterly. And so therefore, getting the updated feed from the government in each country becomes really important to make sure that you're staying current on what the rules are and what the cost structures are. Now, obviously, I'm guessing you guys are absolutely slammed with your customers having concerns about how tariffs are going to affect them, how they can maybe work around some of these high tariff countries, especially, for example, LATAM got away largely unscathed. It was mostly 10% across the board, whereas Southeast Asia and Asia got absolutely hammered, right? Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, they all got absolutely slaughtered. China got slaughtered, right? So now all of a sudden, I'm sure a lot of your customers are saying, look, if we route goods from Vietnam to Latin America, and then they're on-sold effectively as the merchant of record from a Latin American company, now am I at 10% or am I at 30 or 40%? So there are a lot of, it's very opaque is what I would say. And so this is where a freight forwarder almost acts like a legal advisor around how we can legally comply with the law, but also minimize the impact of things like taxes, levies, and tariffs. Is this something that is starting to really become a core part of your business? Because up until now, when tariffs are the same for long periods of time with minor changes, everybody knows the lay of the land. But when things get upended very rapidly across the board, now it's all hands on deck, isn't it?
Yeah. So let me ask you a question, but I'm going to make a full disclaimer ahead. I'm not an attorney.
Yeah.
So anything I say should not be taken as legal advice.
Of course.
Now, I don't know how deep you want to go, how geeky you want to become, but I'm ready for it if you want.
Love it. I'm sure my audience is too.
Okay, great. So let's start on the surface level. On the surface level, if you're shipping a product from China, which happened the past 40 years, tremendously, right? Shipping from China to Mexico, it just quadrupled. It increased air freight, ocean freight, everything. And warehouses popped open in a way. So when you ship something, it's called transshipping. All you're doing is you're shipping to Mexico and then you're fulfilling orders and delivering to customers. Needless to say, that means that the country of origin is China. Okay, there's no way around it. Obviously, if you want to commit crime and you want to falsify documents, it's easy to do so if you're fulfilling the direct orders to consumers because of the loophole of the de minimis. Why? Because Section 321, the de minimis loophole, I call it loophole, but whatever, people want to call it whatever they want, is not only allows it duty and tariff-free import, but it also has minimal oversight. Because the way it's done is very automated and the minimal amount of human interaction. So you could do it with 1,000 line items and it gets cleared in the air, and it works like electronically. You submit a package with hundreds of packages and it gets cleared So my question is always, how in the world would customs even catch you? Okay. And that's part of what President Trump actually claims is that opioids, the amount of opioids that's been imported and smuggled into the US is as high because of the low value de minimis. Anyway, so again, back to the first scenario, surface level, you're shipping from China to Mexico. You want to claim that it's made in Mexico, completely false, completely fraud. And if you're doing it, you're committing fraud. But again, they wouldn't catch you because it's
very difficult to even know, because let's say it even gets removed from the cartons that came in from Mexico, and then they got put into new boxes that had Mexican labeling, Mexican language, everything in Spanish, all the inserts, all the packing slips, everything were in Spanish, to where it literally looked like it originated from a factory in Mexico. And U.S. Customs is not going to come across the border, go to the address where this supposed factory is, and make sure that it's actually a factory. It's just one of those things that it was a loophole. And so help me and my audience understand, are they effectively doing away with the de minimis rule altogether? Or are they just dramatically lowering it?
Okay. So on the China, but I don't want to get carried away from the country origin, so we'll get back to that. China is going to be eliminated May the 2nd.
Okay.
And that means that even a product that's worth $1 is going to be subject to full tariffs, full duties, and regular shipping, regular customs.
Wow. So it has to go through the full customs process.
Yes. So again, we're getting carried away, but I'm going to continue with that for a second. We're going to get geeky again for a minute. How does AliExpress fulfill orders for $0 shipping or 20 cents shipping? How in the world is it possible when you and we're going to go and try to book something, even with USPS, the cheapest carrier, it's going to cost you $30 to $60 a package, even as small as a parcel? How is it possible? The way it works is that when you look at the multi-model, or the way they do it, they don't use UPS, they don't use DHL per se. They have a layer on top of each other structure of how it's done. So in China, they'll consolidate in a warehouse every week a bunch of small parcels. That happens with a warehouse with the local postal services. The shipping cost is going to be a penny an item or something like that. Then they have a weekly slot booked on an air freight on the airline. Okay. So again, they have a negotiated rate. So it's cheaper than what you would have paid when you book it with the airline. So again, when you look at the total cost of that slot, whether it's a skit or 2 skits or whatever it is, it comes out to be another cent or another couple of cents per item, right? And then once it arrives to JFK or LAX, where the biggest hubs were for e-commerce shipments, it goes into a bonded warehouse. And from that bonded warehouse, they'll feed it either at Pitney Bowes or DHL e-commerce and some of these other carriers where they have discounted rates with USPS to deliver for a fractional cost. So when you look at all of these, it only works if you can keep every segment, every model of transportation as low as a couple of cents per unit. What happens if every parcel has to go through regular custom? And we're not gonna go into detail specifically what type of custom, but it's not gonna be the Type 86, the Section 321. Type 86, the one that they use, costs 15 cents at entry. You have been importing, it's gonna cost anywhere between $100 to $200 for customs clearance, right?
Yes.
Now think about that jacket that your wife bought on AliExpress last week. What if you have $100 custom clearance fee on that jacket? Is it still going to be attractive? Not at all.
The jacket might still be $20, but the total cost is going to be $120 just because of the customs clearance cost.
Exactly. And not even the duties. We're not talking about the duties. We're talking about the infrastructural change that happened. And obviously, if you add on the duties, they become less advantageous as opposed to U.S. merchant. So that's what's going to happen on the e-commerce side with the elimination of the Section 321. But to be clear, it's only on China for now. They are working on a revision of the Section 321 across the board. But frankly speaking, I don't know how soon it's going to become possible. And I don't want to give anyone
misleading information, something like that.
And I don't want to say this because I don't want to give bad advice. That's what I'm trying to say, is if you're going to ship e-commerce from Vietnam, you can still take advantage of the loophole. But again, it's fraud. So the question is how soon Trump is going to notice a trend of more e-commerce shipments coming from Vietnam. And it's going to be like, please give me a break. This is not Vietnamese shipment.
Yes.
But let me get back to the country of origin.
So sorry, let me finish off that line of thinking. So not only are goods that are coming from China no longer going to be under the radar of the de minimis rule, because the de minimis is effectively going to be eliminated for China. So they're not going to get fast-tracked through customs anymore at that super low rate. So that's the first thing. And then in addition to the high customs fees per parcel, we are also, in addition to that, going to have default 45% tariff on top of the customs fees from anything coming in. So basically, we're probably talking an additional 75%. Who knows? It could be an additional 100% cost over what it is today.
Or 1,000%, because if you paid 15 cents with the customs clearance and you're paying $125, you do the math. It's a huge increase. And basically, it breaks the model that AliExpress, Shein,
Temu, all of them.
It breaks the model. They cannot exist, which is why if rate has jumped just last night, it climbed crazily, and it's going to be as high for the next couple of weeks leading up to May 2. Because what they're doing is they're stockpiling. Temu, Shein, they signed a bunch of leases in the US and they're stockpiling as much as they can. It bothers me because if you're doing something for President Trump, if you're doing something, you better do it right. But now you're allowing them, okay, come in, set up shop, and then I'll close it. But I'm hoping that either way, the dust is gonna settle, and hopefully, I feel that not only Amazon sellers, but in not only e-commerce sellers, I think retailers, wholesalers, distributors, we all felt that portion of what went to Temu and Shein. The statistics for, I think it was 2022 or 2023, was close to $500 million trade for the Type 86, for the de minimis. But I could tell you that it really, in 2024, it really took off. So I don't know the number, but it's a lot. And if you look at it, the number that USPS is telling you for de minimis is falsified, because everyone knows that the numbers were false.
Yes.
When a Chinese is going to ship something, they're going to falsify the value, but also the value that they are going to report is their cost. So when
not the real market price.
Exactly. So when you want to know what impact it has on the retail market in the US,
you have no idea. You can't even estimate it.
But just even if you want to guess and say operating at a 20% margin, 80% margin, talking about 100 and $1.5 billion in trade, if my math is right. But that's for 2022. We're talking about crazy numbers. So I'm outspoken on that topic. If you look me up on LinkedIn, I've been outspoken on that topic for a long time. I feel that the shift for manufacturing began in 1990, and that train left already.
Yeah.
It's gone. So you want to make an argument to bring manufacturing back in the US? Look, admirable. I don't know if it's going to work. And I really hope that US business will figure out how to navigate these next couple of years. But why don't you stop retail from going overseas? Because that's what happened in the past couple of years is until, let's say, prior to COVID, you have manufacturing done overseas and the goods sold by Target, Macy's, Bed Bath & Beyond, and obviously small businesses like what our Amazon sellers, e-commerce sellers consist of. Okay. And that changed. What portion of Amazon sellers right now are Chinese on Amazon? And how many sales did retail stores lose to Temu and Shein? So you're allowing intentionally for retail to follow suit. Manufacturing moved overseas. I get it. The intention was to bring lower cost product to consumers because they said we're losing manufacturing jobs, but we're getting it back in the total aggregate by having more retail jobs, more salespeople in retail stores, more logistics, more accountants, and everything else that happens as a result of more sales. But now what they have, and it was unbeknown to them, is that they allowed for retail to move overseas, and that wasn't the intention of bringing China into the World Trade Organization in 1990. And I think that's the most important thing that has to stop. So I'm happy that it started with China, and hopefully it's going to continue. But who am I to say?
But how does this affect all the businesses? So is American trade with China effectively going to stop now? It feels like this is a death blow to Chinese trade with America, barring some sort of trade agreement, which it feels like that's what Trump is trying to effectively force, is to say, look, you have massive tariffs on vehicles, you have massive tariffs on all these goods coming into China from America, agriculture goods, et cetera, et cetera. We've got all these massive tariffs to where effectively all of the trade is one way today. It's one way from China to America, and almost nothing goes from America to China, right? They're trying to boost up domestic demand so that they never have to get anything from America ever again. And they're trying to boost up Chinese supply, right? And they're trying to match those to where they no longer are reliant on consumers in America, reliant on consumers in Canada, Southeast Asia, LATAM, etc., right?
Yeah.
But they're not there yet. That's the reality. Is if this had gone on for another decade, that may have been the case, and this would be a very different discussion. But domestic demand cannot in China replace American demand, at least for the foreseeable future. So this feels, to a degree, Trump is holding all the cards in many respects. Sure, domestically, it may be unpalatable. Sure, domestically, Americans have become drug addicted to their cheap goods, to their cheap jackets, to their cheap clothing, to basically have a super low cost of living versus many other places in the world because of all these cheap goods coming in from China, right? Now, how do you, if you were to just take a guess, how you see this likely playing out? Because the Chinese, my wife's Asian, so she's half Chinese, half Vietnamese. So I get the Asian mindset because I have a lot of Asian friends and my wife's Asian. So they think in terms of multi-generational planning. They have no short-term thinking. They're not thinking next week, next month, next year, not even 10 years out. They're thinking 50, 100, 200, 300 years out. That's the Asian mindset, is so long-term thinking that most Westerners have no idea how to think on those kind of time, multi-generational time scales. Mm-hmm. Most Westerners, it's never been part of our culture. And so it's very difficult for us to imagine how to move the chess pieces around in such a way that it has a multi-generational positive impact. So how we have Americans and fast-moving, fast-thinking, fast-talking, fast-acting, and then we have Trump, which is a total wild card. Regardless of what you think about him, he's trying to do something that hasn't been tried in America before. And the reality is, with a $40+ trillion deficit, you got to do something. Otherwise, the dollar will lose its world reserve status. And ultimately, America will probably default on its debt, and the USD will lose reserve currency status. And he was trying to prevent that from happening. Sure, there's always going to be, when you've had 50 years of USD hegemony over the world, there's going to be massive disruption. Anytime America sneezes, the world gets a cold. That's the adage, right?
Yeah.
But if we had to speculate on how China will receive these changes, because it's going to decimate demand in China, what happens?
It's a jam-packed question. And I think for starters, I'll say, I don't know. But obviously I can think and I could philosophize with you together today. So I'm going to say this. We know, and you've probably seen, especially if your wife she has ties to China, you probably know they have a similar to 2008 crisis.
Yes.
If you think back to how America looked like in 2008, it was devastating. People didn't know what tomorrow is going to bring. If you think today is a bad economy, think back to 2008. So adding on the GDP, the decrease thereof of what China is going to experience, and the loss of revenue that they have already experienced by sellers and businesses moving to Vietnam and to Malaysia and so on and so forth. How come Xi Jinping, is his name right? How come he didn't fall to his knees and beg Trump, please do not kill me, please do not slaughter me? Because that's essentially what's going to happen to China in full essence of it, with a housing crisis of the magnitude of what they have, and with losing as much market share that they have lost in the past couple of years, and especially the past few weeks. I have had conversations with people that consisted only of talking about which country to go and how to help them shift production. Sourcing companies have been swamped with requests. So how come he has not climbed down his tree and come and beg Trump for something? And from the logistics, from customers' perspective, President Trump has said numerous times that he's open for negotiation, and he said numerous times that he wants that.
Yes.
I cannot tell you how sincere he was because I don't know. And frankly speaking, I don't think anyone knows. But why haven't you tried? The second the IEEPA, the 20% tariff, as we know it, came into effect on Canada and Mexico, what did they do the first day, especially the Mexican president? She came to Trump. She said, let me talk to you. Let's have a deal. And what happened as a result? It was paused once, it was paused twice. And now it's still on pause. Even April 2 came and nothing happened. He said it's going to be paused only until April 2. You know how easy it was for Xi Jinping to do that? Why didn't he? Again, to answer your question, I think they will have devastating effect if they don't do anything drastic. So what is it going to take for Xi Jinping to climb down his tree and break his ego? I don't know. I'm not his advisor, but I would definitely tell him that it's time to put his ego aside and to look out. And you're saying, I like the sentiment that you said, they're multi-generational, and that is so true. And I know I could tell you any economist will say the same. The reason why China is the China we know it is because they had the vision that they had 30 years ago.
Yes.
Only because of that. But in certain times, multi-generational thinking maybe is going to keep you stuck.
Yes.
Face what do they say? Wake up and smell the coffee. You're no longer at a position where you could say, I have the rest of the world at my fingertips. It's no longer the case. Especially production moves to Mexico, production moves to Vietnam, Taiwan, Malaysia. I don't know. I think they will have a devastating effect if they don't do anything drastic. I don't know if they do anything drastic, if it's even going to help, because you see Canada offer to drop tariffs and Trump ignored them. Actually, maybe not, because at the end of the day, Canada has 0 right now, if it's USMCA. So maybe it did help, but Israel offered to drop tariffs and Trump just slapped them with a 17% tariff. Although Israel didn't have much to offer anyway, because they have a free trade agreement anyway. So dropping tariffs means what? 11 million in trade? It's nothing. But the point that I'm trying to make is, why didn't he try? He should try, because his future looked bleaker than our future, for sure.
Yes, I think Trump wisely realized that, and again, regardless of how you feel politically about Trump, whether you like him, whether you hate him, whether you're a lefty, whether you're a righty, doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, I think Trump is genuine in the sense that he believes that America should come first, meaning that everything that he does, he is going to wield the stick, the big giant stick of the American economy. He is going to swing that thing harder and faster than perhaps any president in history has done. And everybody thought that everybody offshoring to China gave them all the power. But all of a sudden, actually, Trump has managed to turn the tables. And he said, now China, being the supplier to the world, is now totally dependent on global demand for their domestic economy. And as a result of that, it really changes your mindset from one of being totally terrified of an all-powerful China to one where you go, what if we turn off the demand taps globally from everything that China produces? This is going to go way worse for them than it is for anybody else. So when you have this concentration of power, yes, the whole world gave a ton of power and a ton of money to China, but it's easy to revoke that power, basically, is what's happening. And it's such an interesting, from a geopolitical perspective, and as someone who's very interested in geopolitics, and as someone who grew up in America, moved to New Zealand, lived in New Zealand for almost 30 years, have been living in Mexico for the last 2.5 years. So as somebody who has quite a lot of international experience, I've traveled quite a lot. I've seen the world through the Middle Eastern eyes. We've been to Dubai. We spent a lot of time internationally. My wife and I, obviously having a mixed race marriage and relationship, I'd like to think that I have a pretty global view of things as opposed to this real narrow typical American view of things. But even for me, who has been watching geopolitics for my entire life, this is unprecedented in the sense that even I don't have a vision of how this plays out.
It's so true, but I don't think anyone has. I was going to Google, have you heard of Out Laufer? He was with Trump's first term, Out Laufer.
No, I don't think I've heard of his name.
His method is called Laufer curve. He's an economist. He was actually with Reagan administration as well. And he served as an advisor to Trump in the first term. I was going to Google what Laufer says now, because I'm really curious to know. He's a clever person, and I've learned a lot from him in economy, in overall economics. I'm curious because I think you're right. The magnitude of what we're facing right now, no one can predict what's going to happen next. And one thing that we can all agree, I think the left and the right, is that Trump has the Americans in mind. The only thing that people are concerned, and I'd say that it's same, left and right, we are concerned whether he knows what he's doing or not, and whether he is going to have a nation to save after all, after the dust settles. Because what happens in the interim? What happens? Maybe we're going to bring manufacturing back, but it takes a while. What happens in the interim? So I think it's scary to think, but and that's my personal, what I try as a person. Okay, I'm involved with businesses, especially small businesses. But it's not easy nowadays with business. I protect my energy. I try never to get carried away to speak politics. I try to keep the conversations political enough to be able to draw a conclusion or a next action item. Because if I'm going to get caught up in arguing and philosophizing about whether he's right or wrong and what's going to happen next, I'm gone.
Yeah.
I can't be creative. I can't help my people the way I'm supposed to. I'm writing these helpful emails, tips and bits and what's not. And I know my only focus has to be whether, there's a good saying, I love it. And I'm going to say this to you. Let me just find it, because the saying goes like this: a pessimist, I love this saying so much, obviously because it's shipping related as well. The pessimist complains about the wind. The optimist expects it to change. The realist adjusts the sail.
I love that.
The realist adjusts the sails. I don't know what the wind is going to make. I don't know where the boat is going to end up going. I'm going to constantly adjust my sails. And I think my message to, again, your listeners and my customers, I have a big percentage of my customers are e-commerce sellers. And I say, your product are going to be bought by consumers tomorrow and next year. And you are the only person that is going to determine whether that seller is you or your competition. So I feel like saying this and shouting this from the top of my lung, when we get caught up in all of this, and obviously the world is in turmoil, I feel like I've been getting messages and phone calls all day, since yesterday's announcement. And if I can stand up, tell you all, I don't know what comes, but you are the only person that is going to determine how you look like in a year from now. And I think this is the most important message. And to your point, Trump is here for you, for us. He wants to protect our businesses. It's not about arguing and fighting. It's about making it work, finding and circumventing some of it, or finding different alternatives. And there are things to do. I'm not going to say that it's not going to be difficult. It's going to be extremely difficult. And frankly speaking, I don't know how. I don't know what I'm going to do or my customers are going to do. But the one thing that I feel is really important is every time I get caught up in politics, I'm like, no, I don't know what's going to happen, but that's not my job. I'm not his political advisor yet. Maybe he's going to hire me. Maybe. Right now, my job is shipping, logistics, customs compliance, country of origin, e-commerce, fulfillment structures. And I've been recently, I started talking about the Jones Act and the Ships for America Act. And if you look at the increase in cost of, let's say 54% on top of China, 54% on top of your cost of goods, what if we could break down the domestic transportation significantly? We all know domestic transportation is broken. We know from other nations how they operate in a much more efficient manner. And I'll use China for example. If you want to ship something from China in the same radius, let's say it's 100 miles, 1,000 miles, 5,000 miles, okay, they will have a more efficient and cheaper way of shipping it, and obviously green it as well, because they have barge and river transportation. We Americans, we do have it, but it's not as utilized. And yes, the Jones Act is to thank for that, but there are ways to work with this, even with the Jones Act. Jones Act basically protects American ship owners and shipbuilding and whatever, without going into detail, again, without getting too geeky.
Yes.
But I think, and this is just one area of what I feel we should all get together to say, there are ways that we can bring our total cost down in order to survive the next few years. And I'll give you another example, because you asked about China, how China is going to look like. But I want to talk about how a US business is going to look like. Obviously, it's going to have devastating effects on US businesses. But if you look at 54%, and with Trump calls it the trade barriers, right? Trade barriers. What does trade barriers mean? Okay, one of the things that trade barriers means is currency manipulation. You're probably very familiar with that.
Oh, yes.
Now, the currency manipulation in China has been admired by many for many years. Why?
Yes.
Because
there's been written about it.
Yeah. What did they accomplish by currency manipulation? Obviously, their GDP grew, but in my language, in business owners' language, what have you accomplished because of that you were able to buy goods for cheaper? So that's a question that I get asked. Are these nations going to negotiate? I certainly hope so. But are they able to negotiate? I don't know. Why? Because if China stops with its currency manipulation, what gives that your product cost is going to go up to a place where you're going to have 54% cost increase in raw material costs, right?
Yes, regardless of what they do from a currency perspective. So on a constant currency basis, it's going to be 54% more expensive.
Exactly. And for the people that are not familiar with currency manipulation, the idea is that China is actively dumping the value of their currency, of the yuan, because they want a US dollar to be more valued so that you can buy with $1, you can buy 6 yen. And as a result, you will have better purchasing power.
Buy more stuff.
What happens as a result? Chinese exports are growing.
GDP goes up.
Exactly. And it's just good old fashioned economics. But from the same perspective, if you look at a 54% increase in cost, why aren't you as afraid of like you are with a 54% in tariff? And again, I'm not taking away the devastating effects that we're going to have in the next few weeks. It's really difficult. I don't know how we're going to navigate through these next few months and years to come. But it's oftentimes cheaper than manufacturing elsewhere.
Yes, couldn't agree more. Listen, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I've appreciated your wisdom, your knowledge, your experience. I'm sure my listeners will as well. Now, if people do want to reach out to you and they want to learn more in their US-based business and they're doing trade internationally and they're really worried about tariffs, they're worried about sourcing, they're worried about freight, they're worried about, is this going to be a COVID-like supply chain disruption? I have a feeling it might. If they want to have a partner like you in their corner to help navigate these turbulent times, what's the best way for them to reach out and get a hold of you and have that conversation?
They could find me on LinkedIn, Abe Orgel, but I think the only Abe Orgel on LinkedIn. They can obviously visit the website. I will have a resource coming out for how to navigate today's day and age. Again, with the same focus, solution-oriented approach. I'm not talking about what happens. I'm talking about what you could do. Break down your cost, your fulfillment strategy, and so much more. It's going to be available on the website, simpleforwarding.com. And I try to publish a lot of helpful articles in there. But then you go on to the website, you'll be able to schedule a call with me as well.
I love it. I really appreciate your time. Now, as we do come down to the end of our time together, this is where I get to flip the script, hand the microphone over to you, let you ask me one question. Any question you like, can be personal or professional. So Mr. Abe Orgel, and he is the CEO of Simple Forwarding in the United States. What is your question for me today?
My question is to you, and I think it's a very important question. Media outlets have led us to believe that Mexico has experienced a significant growth in investment for manufacturers and factories. I looked at the data. I don't see any significantly increase in imports from Mexico to the US. You are on the ground. What do you see in terms of industrial complexes getting built, manufacturing plants getting set up, Asian people coming to manage and to oversee the operations? Is that so? Are you seeing that?
I anecdotally hear, and in 2023, we drove 20,000 kilometers around Mexico while we were traveling, we were vacationing, and we were also trying to find the place where we wanted to live. In Puebla City, which is where I live, the largest Audi and VW factories outside of Germany are based here in Puebla. So more VWs for the North American market and Audis are made in Mexico than in any other country other than Germany, right? So manufacturing is massive here. Aerospace manufacturing is massive here. It has always been, Mexico has always been a very important manufacturing partner for the United States. That was exacerbated during COVID. So there was a lot of reshoring and nearshoring that happened during COVID. Now, I haven't seen, and that happened pretty early on in COVID when basically China shut down. A lot more manufacturing, particularly clothing and other sorts of goods, leather goods, etc., food goods, chilies, all sorts of other things started to become really hot coming out of, pardon the pun, coming out of Mexico. I think that I haven't seen necessarily, Gopal, I'll come back to you. So if you can just log off, I'll come back to you shortly. Thanks. I haven't seen necessarily anything as a result of this tariff discussion. I haven't necessarily seen anything or heard of anything where Mexican businesses are going, wow, this is going to be a boon to Mexico. I think mainly because there was even a question mark over Mexico and how America would treat Mexico. And are they going to treat Mexico any better than they would China? I think that's been the concern. I think if Trump can put some sort of concrete permanent deal in place with Mexico or semi-permanent deal in place with Mexico that says, hey, you're going to have some sort of protected status versus China and Southeast Asia, then I think not only Mexico, but wider LATAM is going to be the beneficiaries of that. And I think Trump's very smart. I think he realizes that a combination of India and LATAM can actually be, in the medium term, a replacement for China as a source for low labor cost input goods, right? He's very smart. He knows that. He knows China is not the only place with low labor costs. And in fact, China is no longer really the home of the lowest labor costs because they became the sourcing partner for the world and they had inflation that was insane as a result. So I think he's pretty smart. I think he's going, okay, who is going to basically put their hand up and bend their knee first to effectively replace China either singularly or in combination with a basket of nations that will become the manufacturing partner to America? Because there are people lining up to be the replacement for China. And if China doesn't bend the knee, there will be other countries that will. And so I think that Mexico absolutely wants to be the proximity, the ease of getting things across the border by a truck, by air, not so much by sea, obviously, apart from obviously up the coast. But the reality is it just makes sense because Canadian goods are expensive because the labor inputs are super expensive. They're more expensive than in America, right? Whereas in Mexico, the labor inputs are low, right? Life expectancies here are high. The labor force is young. So the reality is, I think Trump realizes that there are plenty of countries, Mexico probably right at the front of that queue, ready to put their hand up and say, we'll be your manufacturing partner instead of China. Mm-hmm. You just have to give us the incentive and the confidence to be able to make those investments to make that happen. And what I think what you're going to see is you're going to see the biggest, most successful Chinese companies, if that happens, pour billions of dollars into Mexico to reshore manufacturing capability. And in fact, Mexico will probably do an immigration deal with China to allow Chinese to come into Mexico en masse to set up and operate those factories domestically in Mexico. All I will say is entrepreneurs always find a way. Always. So I'm just as calm about this as you are. One of the reasons I moved to Mexico was so that I could pay cash for the house that I live in right now, so I could lower my living costs to almost nothing. I was never going to be able to do that in New Zealand, where the average mortgage is $1 million. Wow. So the reality is, our cost of living, our fixed overheads here are very low. So I am prepared to weather the storm no matter how long it lasts. And I'm very excited about the prospects for the future of not only Mexico, America, Canada. I'm basically excited about the prospects for the future of just about everybody but China. And so that's where my head is at, is that we will always figure out, and people aren't just going to starve without putting up a fight. They will figure out a way to do trade, whatever the regulatory environment might be at the time. Business always finds a way. That's been my experience. I'm 50 years old. That's been my experience for my whole life, and I don't think it's going to change now.
That makes a lot of sense.
If you'd like to get mentored by Jason for free,
head over to greenwoodconsulting.net, scroll to the bottom of the page, and click Get Mentored by Jason.